For a long stretch of the 20th century, going to the movies meant leaving the house, buying a ticket, and accepting whatever time the theater gave you. Then a plastic cassette changed that rhythm. VHS did not just bring movies into the living room. It quietly taught millions of people that entertainment should wait for them. That shift sounds obvious now, but at the time it felt almost radical. Television had been scheduled, theatrical movies had been distant, and ownership of screen entertainment was limited. VHS helped collapse those boundaries, and once that happened, media culture stopped behaving the old way. But the real story is not just that VHS won. The real story is why it won, what it changed, and how an ordinary machine turned movie nights, family routines, retail streets, and even Hollywood itself into something new. And once that transformation began, there was no clean way back. Because VHS was never only a format war. It was a war over habits. Over who controlled viewing time, who controlled distribution, and who would profit when film and television escaped their old containers. By the end of this story, the cassette on a shelf will look less like a nostalgic object and more like a device that rewired modern entertainment. And the strangest part is this: its biggest impact was not what people watched. It was the fact that they could finally choose when. The road to VHS begins with a rival. In 1975, Sony launched Betamax, one of the first major consumer home video systems, and the idea was powerful enough to feel futuristic on contact. Record television at home, play it back later, and suddenly the TV set stopped being a one-way stream. A year later, JVC introduced VHS for home use, and from that moment the contest was on. People often reduce the story to one simple line: better format wins. But that is almost never how these battles work, and it is not how this one worked either. Betamax earned a reputation for strong picture quality, and Sony believed tightly controlled technology could lead the market. JVC took a different path. Instead of guarding the system too narrowly, it pushed broader adoption, and that difference would become one of the decisive moves in consumer electronics history. Another practical issue mattered just as much: recording time. For ordinary buyers, format debates were not abstract engineering arguments. They were household questions. Can this record a full movie? Can it handle a football game? Can it capture an entire evening without forcing a compromise? That is where the format war turns from technical drama into human behavior. Consumers rarely choose on purity alone. They choose on convenience, price, availability, and whether a machine fits the messy shape of daily life. VHS understood that battlefield better than most people realized. One reason VHS pulled ahead was not magic. It was distribution strategy. JVC licensed the format broadly, which meant more manufacturers could build VHS machines, more stores could stock them, and more customers could find them at more price points. This is the part people miss when they imagine technology history as a clean meritocracy. A format does not dominate only because it is elegant. It dominates when it becomes easy to buy, easy to support, easy to market, and easy to integrate into a growing ecosystem. Once multiple manufacturers joined the VHS camp, abundance itself became persuasive. More hardware meant falling prices. Falling prices meant more homes. More homes meant more demand for tapes, rental stock, accessories, and repair networks. The machine was becoming a system. Betamax did not disappear overnight. For a while, both formats lived side by side, and early adopters argued fiercely over quality and performance. But mass markets are brutal. When one side gains enough momentum, shelf space begins to tilt, and shelf space is often destiny. By then, VHS was no longer just competing against Betamax. It was competing against hesitation. It was asking shoppers to imagine a different future at home, and enough of them said yes that the market began reorganizing around the cassette itself. Yet owning a VCR was not automatically simple. Early machines were expensive, and pre-recorded tapes were not always cheap enough for casual ownership. For a moment, the technology seemed powerful but incomplete, almost as if the machine had arrived before the culture around it caught up. Then a crucial behavior emerged: renting. Instead of buying every movie, people could borrow one for a night or a weekend. That single adjustment unlocked the logic of the whole system, because suddenly a costly tape became a reusable asset and a VCR became a gateway instead of a gamble. This is where home entertainment begins to feel less like engineering and more like culture. The VCR alone was useful. The VCR plus a rental economy was transformative. Now families could sample libraries of films, revisit favorites, and build rituals around choice rather than scarcity. And once customers expected that freedom, the cassette stopped being a niche object. It became part of ordinary domestic planning. Movie night was not an event handed down by broadcasters anymore. It was something you assembled yourself, almost like curating your own tiny theater at home. That emotional shift mattered as much as the business model. VHS turned selection into part of the entertainment. Browsing became a pleasure. Choosing became a ritual. The cassette was no longer just carrying the movie. It was carrying anticipation. Then came the legal battle that could have changed everything. Hollywood studios feared that home recording would damage their control over copyrighted content. If viewers could tape broadcasts and keep them, what exactly would stop television from becoming a giant copying machine? That fear led to one of the defining media cases of the era: Sony versus Universal. At the center was a deceptively simple question. Was home time-shifting, recording a broadcast to watch later, a form of infringement, or a legitimate private use? In 1984, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that non-commercial home recording for time-shifting was fair use, and that manufacturers of devices with substantial non-infringing uses could not simply be held liable for what every buyer might do. It was a legal decision, yes, but it was also a cultural unlock. Because after that ruling, the VCR no longer felt like a machine living under a cloud. It felt legitimate. It felt safer to buy, easier to normalize, easier for retailers to push, and easier for the broader market to build around. Law did not invent VHS culture, but it gave it room to expand. And here is the irony that still echoes across media history: a technology once feared as a threat to entertainment became one of its biggest engines of profit. The machine accused of undermining Hollywood would soon help teach Hollywood how much money lived beyond the theater. Once the market settled, VHS stores began to multiply. Some were tiny local shops with handwritten recommendations. Others grew into sleek chains built on inventory depth, barcode systems, and the promise that there was always something to take home. Blockbuster's first store opened in 1985, and it represented a new stage of the business. This was not just renting movies. It was systematizing the experience: bigger catalogs, standardized layouts, visible branding, and a polished retail atmosphere that made home video feel mainstream. This changed neighborhoods as much as living rooms. The video store became a local social space. Teenagers wandered the horror aisle. Parents negotiated over family films. Clerks developed opinions, regulars built routines, and cover art itself became a form of persuasion. What made these stores powerful was not only access. It was abundance arranged for discovery. Shelves turned media into a landscape. You could walk through genres, compare moods, and stumble into a film you had never planned to watch. Search became physical. And that browsing behavior matters, because it shaped the psychology of later digital platforms. Before menus on a screen, there were walls of tapes. Before algorithmic suggestion, there was the hand reaching for a box because the cover looked strange, exciting, or impossible to ignore. For viewers, the revolution felt intimate. Kids rewatched the same animated films until the tape wore thin. Teenagers built identity through rented horror, action, and music documentaries. Parents recorded broadcasts, archived holidays, and discovered that the television set could now serve memory as well as entertainment. This is where VHS becomes more than a movie story. It enters birthdays, school plays, awkward living rooms, and the visual texture of private life. The same format that delivered studio films also captured ordinary people trying to preserve moments they were afraid to lose. The VCR also changed television itself. Once viewers could record shows and watch later, scheduling lost some of its old authority. Broadcasters still controlled the original slot, but they no longer controlled the entire experience. For the first time at scale, audiences were pushing back against the clock. And think about what that means psychologically. A viewer who can pause, save, replay, and revisit develops a different relationship to media than a viewer who only receives. Ownership, even partial ownership, changes attachment. Repetition deepens fandom. Control deepens habit. That is one of VHS's least visible legacies. It trained audiences for the future. Binging did not begin with streaming. Personalized viewing did not begin with apps. Long before digital platforms, a cassette and a timer had already started teaching people to expect entertainment on their terms. Hollywood, meanwhile, had to adjust to a reality it did not fully control. Theatrical release was still prestigious, but VHS created a second life for films. A movie was no longer done when it left theaters. It could travel again, earn again, and find new audiences in homes far from major cinemas. That mattered for blockbusters, but it also mattered for smaller titles, catalog films, and genres that gained strength through repeat viewing. Horror especially thrived in home video culture, because a film that looked too risky, too niche, or too strange for a broad theatrical audience could suddenly build a second existence on rental shelves. VHS also widened access to world cinema, older classics, workout tapes, concert films, children's programming, and direct-to-video releases. The home became a multipurpose exhibition space. It could be a cinema, a classroom, a concert hall, or a babysitter, depending on what slid into the machine. This is why the home video era deserves the word revolution. It did not just preserve the old movie business in another format. It diversified what counted as viable screen culture. New release windows, new revenue streams, and new viewing categories started to reshape the economics of what got made. And once studios realized that the home was not merely a threat but a marketplace, the cassette gained a different status. VHS was no longer just tolerated. It became a core part of entertainment strategy, one shelf at a time. But every revolution leaves behind a texture, and VHS had one you could almost feel. The clunk of insertion. The mechanical whir. The soft snow of tracking problems. The rewinding ritual. This was media with friction, and that friction made it strangely memorable. People remember the format not just because of what it showed, but because it announced itself physically. You handled it. Stacked it. Labeled it. Repaired it with patience. Sometimes you even opened the shell in a moment of quiet panic when the machine decided to eat your favorite tape. That materiality shaped memory. A digital file can vanish without ceremony. A VHS tape aged in public. The box corners softened. The labels faded. The image degraded. Every replay left a trace, as if the object itself was recording your attachment to it. There was also the aesthetic. VHS did not look clean, and that became part of its identity. Softness, bleed, tape noise, unstable color, flaws that once signaled limitation now trigger nostalgia because they belong to an era when media still felt mechanical, local, and human-scaled. That is why VHS survives as a mood long after it faded as a dominant format. It carries not just content, but a sensory memory of how content used to arrive. And for a lot of people, that feeling is inseparable from childhood, discovery, and the first moment media felt personal. Of course, VHS did not last forever. Laserdisc stayed niche, DVD arrived with sharper image and easier navigation, and digital media eventually erased many of the format's inconveniences. But replacement does not erase impact. A newer technology can win without diminishing what the older one already changed. Because by the time VHS began to decline, its real work was done. It had normalized home libraries. It had trained studios to think beyond theaters. It had trained audiences to expect convenience, replay, access, and private control. Later formats inherited those expectations rather than inventing them. That makes VHS one of those technologies whose deepest victory becomes almost invisible. Once a revolution succeeds, its assumptions start to feel normal. Watching what you want, when you want, at home, sounds ordinary only because older battles were won so completely that most people forgot there was a battle at all. And yet every so often, the old cassette returns in documentaries, collector circles, horror aesthetics, retro stores, and memory-driven design. Not because it is more efficient. Because it still symbolizes a turning point, the moment the screen stopped dictating terms and began responding to the viewer. That is a rare legacy for any consumer format. Most devices become obsolete and stay there. VHS became obsolete, then became iconic, because its role was bigger than playback quality. It marks the birth of home entertainment as a dominant cultural force. So when people talk about VHS, they often talk about rewinding tapes, rental aisles, or grainy family recordings. All of that matters. But underneath the nostalgia sits a harder truth. VHS helped redraw the power map of entertainment. It shifted control away from rigid schedules and toward the viewer. It widened the economic life of films. It built new retail cultures, new domestic rituals, and new expectations that still shape how media platforms compete today. A plastic cassette did all that, and it did it quietly. That may be the most fascinating part of the story. Revolutions are often imagined as loud, sudden, and obvious. The home entertainment revolution was different. It entered through electronic stores, rental counters, suburban cabinets, and ordinary Friday nights, then changed the world from inside the house. And maybe that is why VHS still lingers in memory with such force. It was not just watched. It was lived with. It sat on shelves, waited beside televisions, and became part of how people organized time, pleasure, and memory itself. So here is the question. Was VHS simply an old format, or was it the machine that taught modern audiences how they wanted to live with media? Drop your take in the comments, and subscribe before the next forgotten technology changes the way you see the past.